good morning. Happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And I have a guest here, Gardis Watts, and we're going to have a discussion. So, Gardis, I'll let you take it away.
Hey, good morning. Yeah. Well, this is going to be probably a more interactive discussion, but
Mm-hmm.
as you know, today is we celebrate the life of Dr. Martin Luther King, and I know for a lot of years, the mainstream media has been, replaying the "I have a dream" speech and Dream as the, King as the dreamer and such and such. Um, Even when we learned about Dr. King, uh, he was a man of peace, uh, a man of nonviolence, and a lot of these things kind of tag him in a very, um, in a very strange light because despite the fact that we think of Dr. King as one of our iconic heroes in Black history, there's been an effort to kind of sanitize his image, uh, and repackage him to a more um, less dangerous type of person. Whereas when we study his life and we look at his work, he was a lot more dangerous than what people, led on to be, even though he was a man that called for nonviolence. And for a long time, as a kid learning about him, I often ask the question, well, if this guy he's never called for violence, he's never called for, and I don't think he's probably hurt a fly physically, but why did he get assassinated? Why was he killed? If he was this nonviolent activist, this man of peace. And then I had to realize, like, well, you look at the life of Jesus Christ. If you're a Christian, you believe that there was a man 2,000 years ago in Palestine who was preaching the kingdom of God, but also calling for love and peace, and yet he was crucified. Even though he's Jesus, outside of him turning tables in the temple, has never did anything violent in his life. So
Exactly.
as I'm studying it, I'm starting to realize that much of the focus of Dr. King has always been in kind of like his first 12 years of public activism, starting with the Montgomery bus boycott movement, all the way to the Voting Rights Act. Uh, and those are very important and significant things. Dr. King helped get the Civil Rights Bill pushed and the Voting Rights Act bill pushed, and successful campaign in Montgomery and Birmingham and in various places. However, when we talk about what happened with mainstream media and what their focus is, and even our education system, when we talk about Dr. King, they have us focus on that particular life. But when I start looking at Dr. King's last 3 years, I see somebody who transitions from a person who fought for civil rights into much more of a revolutionary type of figure. When we talk about the last 3 years of Dr. King, which is from 65 to 68, I see a person who lost a lot of friends, lost a lot of support during that time because he was advocating for not just civil rights, but human rights. He was advocating for the poor. He was also advocating for nonviolence, not just in this country, but around the world. And during these last 3 years of King's life, which, like I said, this is the more revolutionary type Martin Luther King, um, He identified three evils in society: racism, capitalism, and militarism. He said these three evils are the bane of what society and the issues of it basically breaks down to many of the problems of society is based off of these three evils: racism, capitalism, and militarism. And so when he talks about racism, obviously Dr. King is an anti-racist, a person who fought against racism. The belief that a certain group of people, especially non-white people, are inferior. They are the underclass of the racial hierarchy. And it's something that he fought against during his civil rights campaign because, obviously he sees many people getting lynched, getting killed in the South due to racism. The second evil is capitalism, which he kind of termed as extreme materialism. When you start valuing things and money over the lives of people, this is what he was talking about when he talks about extreme materialism, or like I said, capitalism. When the ultimate goal is money, when the ultimate goal is, economics, and when we're talking about economics without spirituality, without considering the lives of people who get hurt over wealth and gains. Because in a capitalist society, the more people that get rich, the more poor people get, as far as the imbalance of the economics of this world. So he rallies against that. And then also militarism, violence. And, obviously Dr. King lives off of a philosophy of nonviolence. Now, when we talk about nonviolence, we're not talking about, being passive either, because Dr. King was far from being passive. Dr. King was very much an aggressive leader, but he just chooses to react in a different way. When you talk about militarism, you're talking about the Vietnam War, which actually he did a speech in New York, actually almost 1 year before his assassination. He spoke at a church in New York where he campaigned. Well, he did a sermon speaking against the Vietnam War. And in I think many people call it Beyond Vietnam, or he titles it Why I Am Opposed to the Vietnam War. And he breaks it down. If you ever pull up that speech, because you can find it anywhere, he has a lot of details of how that war got started. He has like political analysis in it. He even touches on the history of Vietnam and why Vietnam got into that particular war. So King was not only just a preacher and a reverend, but he was also an astute political analyst, because he definitely saw a lot of things that was wrong with that war. And he speaks out against it. Now, the triple evils of society, as I mentioned, Dr. King basically connects all of them, and everything connects with stuff like the Vietnam War. When you're talking about racism, the Vietnamese people are non-white people. They are people who the capitalist structure, and we go to the second part of capitalism, try to take advantage of when you're talking about Vietnam and basically kind of trying to take advantage of their resources. And then obviously the militarism, the war, the violence that happens, children getting killed. We're sending young men over there to fight in the name of so-called democracy. And, it's basically all for naught. So my dad was a Vietnam veteran. He spent, I think he said he spent between 13 to 14 months there in Vietnam. My dad was in the Air Force for about 20 years. Said it was the worst time of his life. Worst time of his life because he said about 2 months into the war, 2 months into going over there, he literally said that we're not going to win this war. And he said that because of the fact that he saw up front the intestinal fortitude of the Vietnamese people. Like, he said the Vietnamese people would do anything for their freedoms. They would sacrifice their children. They would sacrifice their mothers and sisters, because he said there were literally women fighting for the North Vietnamese people. And he said when you start seeing that, these are people that will do anything to fight for their freedom. And I remember him saying too, because he heard this from a famous Black Panther, Fred Hampton. And he said, you can kill a revolutionary, but you can't kill an ideal. And when he found that the North Vietnamese people were dying over this idea of freedom, he was like, we're not going to win this war. And then 4 months into his campaign, he felt that he wasn't going to make it out of there alive. And, thank God he did, because if he didn't, then I wouldn't be here. So that was his, and this is, like I said, this is firsthand experience from a guy who was actually over there. And so Dr. King basically kind of expressed all of the ills of that war, how it costs lives, how it costs money. United States pouring millions, almost billions of dollars into that war, when there were homeless people here, when there were people that was without food, when there were people here that didn't have enough resources, to survive. And we're supposed to be the richest nation in the world, but yet we have homeless people here. We have people who are on the margins. We have people who are barely surviving. But yet, what is the perception of our country outside of, in the rest of the world? Everybody thinks that Americans here have $1 million in their savings accounts. And I know this because of the fact that I have family members who live outside of the United States. And some of them think that, yeah, we're rich. Where in a realistic sense, that's not the case for everybody here. But because of the fact that Dr. King spoke out against the Vietnam War, he became what many call unpatriotic, because we're given this narrative that our soldiers are fighting for our freedom. Our soldiers are out here fighting for the freedoms and the rights of Americans, which is technically, in the Vietnam War, that wasn't the case. They were sending our soldiers over there in the name of imperialism. Obviously, the United States has had colonies that they have colonized in certain parts of non-white Asia, and also Africa, and some of South America. And it wasn't about protecting our freedoms, because, for one, the Vietnam people were not going to invade or drop bombs on the United States. So we were in no way in danger of being threatened by the Vietnamese people. But yet they keep telling us this narrative that, our army is going over there to fight for our freedoms. And the issue is, and I always say this in respect to Veterans Day, because my father, who was a 20-year veteran, has after he got out of the military, he was very conflicted about some of the stuff that he was basically told to do. But he understood that, sometimes you have to take orders, or you might, you might die or get thrown in the brig or something like that. So I always have to apologize to the veterans, which includes my father, because, when I thank them for their service, I also have to apologize to them for our politicians who give the orders to send these young men and women out to so-called fight for our freedom when they're actually fighting for American imperialism. And so I thank them for their service, but I apologize to them for following bad orders, because our military can be doing more good than harm. And it's all in the name of imperialism. Like, for instance, where was the military at? I'm pretty sure there was military personnel to help the people in Los Angeles for the fires. I didn't see much of the military's presence there, even though they should have been there to help them out. And in certain other natural disasters that happen, military presence is good because of the fact that they can rescue people. They have the equipment to help people out in those particular disasters. So this is where our military can do some good, and also in other countries as well. So Dr. King, who speaks out against those three evils of racism, capitalism, and militarism, basically takes the tone of his activism to another level, because it transforms into more of a spiritual fight than a social fight. See, the social fight was with the civil rights movement, which was in a sense somewhat successful. And I know many people kind of blame him for the integration, and many people feel like integration was the worst thing that ever happened to Black people. I kind of disagree, because the worst thing that has happened to Black people is racism. Wasn't integration. And Dr. King even said it himself that it wasn't that integration was bad. It was the fact that we integrated unequally. And he even admitted this to his friend. I can't think of the Calypso singer's name, but he talks about how he might have integrated his people into a burning house. And so the integration itself was not the problem, because the problem was how we integrated, because we were told to give up a lot of our businesses that we had to develop during segregation, and that our businesses and what we had established during segregation was no longer needed. That's what was killing. Yes, thank you, Scott. Harry Belafonte, who talked about that in his book, because he was a big confidant of Dr. King. So, and a lot of what I'm going to reference in this is from. So Dr. King basically I think he wrote 4 books in his life, and his seminal work is his last book, called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. You can find it online. If anybody wants a digital copy of it, I have it. I can give it to you. But I encourage people to read that book. The book is actually not very long, about 213 pages, so it's an average size book. And it was written by him. It was written by Dr. King. Not too long before he was assassinated. And a lot of it is his political thoughts, his spiritual thoughts, thoughts about a lot of things, including politics, power, authority, racism, um, many things that people never thought Dr. King would actually speak out on. And so for me, I think a lot of topics, because I've outlined the book a lot, and it's sort of like when you read some of the stuff that he wrote, and also too, you could go back to a lot of his speeches. There's a lot of speeches that you find on YouTube that he talks about certain things that you never thought he would have said. And one of the good things about YouTube and social media is that we can recover some of these old films of Dr. King's speeches and interviews that many people never told us when we were learning about it back in public school in the 70s and 80s. So that's a lot of things that Dr. King talked about. But I'll stop here. Do you have anything, Berg?
No, I appreciate you. I think the only thing we haven't gotten to that part yet, but about him being a revolutionary, how did they make it where they kind of stop at the "I have a dream" speech? That's all we talk about, and we don't talk about, like Big Mike was saying, and you were saying 1967 Martin Luther King.
Well, I mean, because the fact is that we fail to go beyond what we're told through mainstream media. And this is why a lot of times we have our leaders handpicked for us, because when we see them on TV, when we see them on TV and they tell us that's who we should follow, then then we follow them. So now, nowadays it's like, now we see them on social media and they tell us that's who we follow. And ironically, it's kind of like it's kind of like the same way King kind of came into prominence, because King was he was a well-known pastor in the South, and his goal wasn't to be somebody that something that he transformed into. His goal when he graduated from seminary school and got his doctorate was to have his own little small church in Atlanta, and then just quietly be a pastor for the rest of his life. But he was actually asked to lead the Montgomery bus boycott movement. He wasn't like, he didn't come up to somebody and say, "Hey, can I lead the movement?" No, he was called to do it. And we had this discussion about Harold Washington, and how Harold Washington was asked to run for mayor. And he was actually reluctant to do it, because Harold, like we said before, Harold Washington lost in the 77 election big time. And he felt like he wasn't going to win it the next time around that they asked him. So Dr. King was the same way. It was like they asked him to come down to Montgomery and help organize the movement. And so from that point on, he found a calling, and that calling was to be one of the civil rights leaders. Now, the thing we also have to understand too is that they isolate Dr. King in this civil rights struggle, because while Dr. King was one of the more prominent figures in the civil rights struggle, he wasn't the only one. There were several other people who they never talk about, like Ella Baker, who was a prominent female civil rights activist. Now, one of the reasons why they don't talk about Ella Baker is because she actually had some conflicts with Dr. King. And not in a sense of, speaking, speaking crassly against him and stuff like that, or he never like gave Dr. King a 48-hour notice or anything like that. But but she always thought that people kind of centered him as the leader. But the one thing that Ella always said was, strong people really don't need centered leaders, because of the fact that when you develop political power, you really don't need a certain person to be leading, people with political power. So she was always very, very strong minded. But the thing is that they never got in each other's way. They both kind of had a purpose. They just had kind of like different roads to, where they're going. But then, other people who actually was in Dr. King's camp, like Rustin Baynard and Abernathy and several other leaders who were actually in Dr. King's camp, that didn't get a lot of shine until later on. But Dr. King was always, they always point the camera in his face. But he wasn't like the sole leader of the civil rights movement. And then we're also not going to talk about, like, people who sacrificed their lives several years before King, like Medgar Evers. So Medgar Evers was a very prominent civil rights activist in Mississippi until he was gunned down by a Klansman. So those were important figures in the civil rights movement. And while Dr. King is always put in the forefront, he was just part of a group of people who made the civil rights movement go. So with that, I think when he transitioned over from being a civil rights activist to kind of like more of a revolutionary human rights activist, or I think Big Mike had said this in the comments, talking about the Poor People's Campaign, because he started because as the story goes, Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, advocating for the garbage workers, because they had a union over there. And obviously garbage workers aren't rich oligarchs. They're people struggling just like everybody else. And he's there to kind of like help them negotiate a contract for a living wage. Now, that's one of the things that Dr. King had always advocated for. So Dr. King was the type of person that advocated for what was called kind of like a living wage type of income. And this living wage income was more geared towards people, more geared towards what the economics of a particular society looks like. So, obviously we kind of have this thing called the minimum wage. And I think the national minimum wage now is what, $15?
I think so. We were just talking about in Illinois. I think so, $15.
Yeah. But realistically, $15 an hour, especially in Chicago or even in the Chicagoland area, is not really a living wage. I mean, you could literally work 100 hours a week and you still won't obtain a living wage with just $15 an hour. And so Dr. King, in his book, talks about the what he calls the guaranteed income. And what he talks about is eliminating poverty with this guaranteed income. And so I want to read an excerpt here from his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Because he talks about the guaranteed income. And I'm going to start from this paragraph on page 173, where he says, we are likely to find that the problem of housing and education, instead of preceding the elimination of poverty, will themselves be effective if poverty is first abolished. The poor transformed into purchasers will not do a great deal on their own to alter housing decay. Negroes who have a double disability will have a greater effect on discrimination when they have additional weapons of cash to use in their struggle. Beyond these advantages, a host of positive psychological changes inevitably will result from widespread economic security. The dignity of the individual will flourish when the decision concerning his life are in his own hands, when he has the assurances that his income is stable and certain, and when he knows that he has the means to seek self-improvement. Personal conflicts between husband, wife, and children would diminish when the unjust measurements of human worth on a scale of dollars is eliminated. Two conditions of indispensable if we are to ensure that the guaranteed income operates on a consistently progressive measure. First, it must be pegged to the median income of society, not at the lowest level of income. To guarantee an income at the floor would simply perpetuate welfare standards and freeze into a society poverty conditions. Second, the guaranteed income must be dynamic. It must automatically increase as the social income grows. Were it permitted to remain static under growth conditions, the recipient will suffer a relative decline. If the periodic reviews disclose that the whole nation income has risen, then the guaranteed income would have to be adjusted upward towards the same percentage. Without these safeguards, a creeping retrogression would occur, nullifying the gains of security and stability. So Dr. King was fighting for something like this. Guaranteed income where it's dynamic, where it fluctuates when inflation increases, because we just talked about $15 an hour. That's not even sustainable for a high school person.
Yeah.
So why, I think an economist said that if there was a minimum wage that has to be comparable to a living wage, the minimum wage standards has to be at least $45 an hour to get you out of that poverty level. Now think about that. You have to at least make $45 an hour and work 40 hours a week just to put you over the poverty level. We're at $15 an hour. So this is what Dr. King was fighting for. And this is actually what got him in trouble with a lot of the elites, because many people have accused Dr. King of being a socialist, a capitalist. I mean, not a capitalist, but a socialist and a Marxist communist. And Dr. King in his book, spoke out against communism as well, because he felt that communism was what. Well, here's the contrast, because Dr. King, he still kind of believed in the he kind of believed in what was more of a human capitalism, a capitalism that that still gave the worth of a human person. Still, you're able to gain whatever wealth you have, but not at the expense of human lives. So he always talked about this thing called the revolution of values. And I think what he meant by that was that these static terms of capitalism and communism, because he always felt like capitalism focused too much on the individual person and it never talked about the community. But he also criticized communism of being too much into the community and you losing your self-identity, because he always felt like the identity, someone's identity is always important, but he always talked about the revolution of values. and these values have to sustain not only the individual person spiritually, but also the community. So I want to read this excerpt in his book, Where Do We Go From Here, page 197, where he talks about the revolution of values. And he says, this revolution of values must go beyond traditional capitalism and communism. We must honestly admit that capitalism has often left a gulf between the superfluous wealth and abject poverty, has created conditions permitting necessities to be taken from the many to give luxuries to the few, and has encouraged small-hearted men to become cold and conscienceless, so that, like dives before Lazarus, they are unmoved by suffering, poverty-stricken humanity. The profit motive, when it was the sole basis of an economic system, encourages a cutthroat competition and selfish ambition that inspire men to be more I-centered than thou-centered. Then he continues to say, equally, communism reduces men to a cog in a wheel of the state. The communist may object, saying that in Marxian theory, the state is an interim reality that will wither away when the classless society emerges. True in theory, but it is also true that while the state lasts, it is an end in itself. Man is a mean to that end. He has no inalienable rights. His only rights are derived from and conferred by the state. Under such a system, the fountain of freedom runs dry. Restricted are man's liberties of press and assembly, his freedom to vote, and his freedom to listen and to read. So when you read that, how is Dr. King a communist?
My goodness.
But I mean, he also critiques capitalism as well.
Mm-hmm.
So where do people get that Dr. King was an undercover communist? Because this was always his detractors' criticism of him. And in U.S. history, we always talk about the Red Scare that happened in the early 20th century. So as communism starts to grow in different parts of the world, many of the capitalist countries, including the United States, kind of fought against this different system of economics and politics. And you started to see in the early 20th century, many people who were dissatisfied with the capitalist system started to turn to communism. So our government decided to repress many of the people because there was a United States Communist Party that was formed in the late 19th, early 20th century, off the basis of Karl Marx's idea of this communist system. And the thing was that this Red Scare was very repressive. Like they locked people up. They locked people up unjustly. There was police violence against these people. People were thrown in front of Senate hearings, accusing these people of being unpatriotic. And so when people talk about the Red Scare and these different repressive things that people had, with different ideas of capitalism, it harkens back to what the government has done to people like communists. But then this also doesn't stop with the communists. It starts with Black folks. It starts with immigrants. It starts with people with different ethnic groups, and basically all people who are classified as non-white, or even people who don't think, of in the same sense of the white Euro capitalist type of person. And so these people had to be repressed by any means, whether it be thrown in jail, whether it be sometimes executed, for their non-patriotism. This is why the Black Panthers were an easy target, because of the fact that a lot of their philosophies was directed towards a more communist type of mindset and thought. And it makes sense because of the fact that when you think of the capitalist system and how the way Dr. King laid it out is such an imbalance where the more people get rich, the more poor people start showing up. It's a system that basically undervalues human life. And so when you think about the capitalist system and how it has hurt a lot of people than helped, you often wonder why when we listen to these presidential debates, or actually listen to any political debates of people running for office, rarely do you find, if any, you find people saying what they're going to do for the poor and homeless.
Exactly.
Nobody talks about that. Nobody talks about what are we going to do for the poor and homeless. And Berg, I mean, we can ride around not just Chicago, but Southland, find homeless people, find people without homes. And, let's pray for all those people who don't have, who don't have a home or even a shelter to go to in these next couple of days, because we're going to be experiencing below zero weather.
Yeah.
And this is the America we live in. This is the America we live in. And then we're not even talking about the folks who probably do have homes who are struggling day by day, check to check. People who are struggling to get their, to keep their lights on. People who might have homes that don't have food to feed themselves nor their children. I mean, I work at a school district where half the student population is below the poverty level. And their only source of reliable food is when they go to school. And so this is the country that we live in.
We have a great question for you, Gardis from Big Mike. Gardis, how do you feel when President Obama took the oath of office in 2013 using Martin Luther King's Bible?
I thought it was a contradiction. Um, just like with many people, I had high hopes for President Obama. I voted for him in 2008, and I was very gung ho about it. First Black president, United States history. But after I saw what he did in his first couple of years in office, especially when he took office when there was an economic crisis that was happening. Obviously the financial industry was in major issues with the Lehman Brothers problem. The housing bubble bursted, and the world went into kind of like an economic recession. So many people lost their homes, many people lost jobs. And what was he talked into kind of revitalizing the economy? He talks the government into giving, I believe it was $75 billion or maybe $1 trillion to the banks. These were the institutions that caused the Great Recession during that time. But he wanted to infuse the banks with this capital instead of giving it to the people who really needed it. And then after a couple of years, when he gave this money to, most of the banks didn't even do what they were supposed to do with it. And there were no repercussions. nobody really said, nobody really put the executives in jail for misusing these funds. And like what do we see recently? People using the PPP loans, for whatever, and they're getting like thrown in jail or getting sued and getting like their properties and all their assets taken away because of the fact that they misappropriated PPP loans. Them banks 15, 16 years ago, nothing happened to them. Yeah, and Big Mike is right. Goldman Sachs donated millions of dollars to his campaign. So the luster of the first Black president wore off very quickly for me. So by 2013, that's when I just decided to just write my own name in for president. Never since then, I never really voted for any president on a ticket. Yeah, I just basically either wrote my name or wrote Minister Farrakhan's name in for president.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I understand. It was with the inauguration going on today, on Martin Luther King Jr.'s celebration day. How do you think? Do you think that was? I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you think that was kind of disrespectful? Could it have waited one more day, or?
Um, I mean, typically inaugurations are on the 20th.
Okay.
So, um, yeah, maybe that could have pushed it back a day or so. But typically, yeah, president is supposed to come in on the 20th,
On the
and
20th. Okay.
yeah. So I guess they couldn't really avoid it.
Brandon says, "What was the reaction in the Black community and beyond to Dr. King bringing his movement to Chicago?" That's a great question. I've been researching that as well, Brandon.
Yeah. So, and this was during Dr. King's time of when he started to realize that the issues of Black people in the South were a little different from the issues of Black people in the North, because what he started to confront was the issue um, of not just racism but uh, economic deprivation. Because you see, in the South, Black people were were not as economically deprived, and I'm not saying that they weren't. But when you compare it to what was going on in the South compared to what was going on in the North, it was major differences. And so when Dr. King came up here in 66, he saw something that he never saw in the South. And he saw a lot of racial vitriol. And Dr. King even said it himself that um, that the racial violence that he experienced up here was was worse than what he was experiencing in places like Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia, which was kind of crazy because that's where most of the lynching was happening. But when he says that, I mean that's that's very important. But to the question of Black folks, you know, Dr. King, it's so funny. Many Black people received him. However, there were still a handful of ministers uh, here in Chicago who spoke out against King's presence here because, for one, it King's presence knew that it was going to disrupt a lot of what the Black ministers here were getting at, and many of the Black ministers here were in Richard J. Daley's pockets, and Old Man Daley was not a big fan of Dr. King. So when Dr. King came up here, it was obvious that he was going to disturb a lot of things, in which he did, because King found various economic deprived Black areas, many projects that was blighted, forgotten about, and his work here, um, even though he only spent about maybe a year up here, I mean, it still was unfinished because of the fact that there was so much to do here that he obviously had to get more people here to help out with the poor conditions of Black folks here, because he couldn't spend several years here trying to help fix this. But there were ministers here who did speak out against King. Now, what's so funny is, and there were ministers who were very prominent ministers later on in life. And if you heard some of the names that spoke out against him, you would be like, "What? Him?"
Wow.
But it's so funny because there were you hear a lot of ministers who said, "Yeah, I remember when I when I met Dr. King." Old ministers who talked about they met Dr. King when he first got up here, blah 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 blah. But when he got up here, I think the first church he went to was oh man, what is that? What is that church over there by White Sox Park?
It's
It's a
not
church.
Pilgrim, is it?
It was, yeah, I believe it was Pilgrim.
Mm-hmm.
And who was the old minister there? Um, yeah, I forgot his name. Somebody put it in the comments. But I remember him talking about it years ago, and he said when Dr. King first came to my church, it was like 16 people there.
Oh wow. So Big Mike said, Quinn Chapel.
Oh, was it Queen Chapel?
Um,
Okay,
and then I
I,
have
I thought it was Pilgrim,
Cl- Clay
but
Clay Evans.
yes, Clay Evans. Yeah, Clay Evans was the one that basically said that, because Clay Evans was one of the few ministers that welcomed Dr. King. And yeah, he said it was like only like about 16 people there.
Oh wow.
But
And it's
everybody, but if you tell you ask, like 1,000 people, yeah, they'd be like, yeah, I was there, I was there. Now, how could 1,000 people said that they greeted Dr. King, where it was only Clay Evans, who was one of the ministers receiving, was like, yeah, it was only 16 people there. Almost like when I was, when I talked about going to the Thornton Township meetings before 2024.
everybody was like, I was there, and it's like it was 6 people here,
There was 6
maybe.
people there. Yeah, exactly. So so you had those group of ministers who kind of spoke out against King, and I'm not sure what the overall thought about King was with Chicago during that time, but I think that they were most of them were very much in support of Dr. King when he first came to Chicago. But I think his encounter with the Northern issue, as he calls it, opened his eyes to a lot of things, because I'm going to talk about another situation when Dr. King went to L.A. When the Watts riots happened, and he was called out there to kind of quell the violence. And so that's when actually Dr. King got a real wake up call. So, for historical context, there was a big riot in Watts, California, August 1965. We talked about that in our Black August episode. And when Dr. King experienced the people out in Watts, California, they kind of lashed back at him because of the fact that he was doing so much work in the southern part of the country, that they they felt like they were forgotten about him during that time. Because I mean, there were Black folks everywhere. Because if you remember the Great Migration patterns, they just didn't go to the northern cities; they went to California as well. And so I want to read this excerpt. Now, this is actually one of my favorite books about Dr. King, but it just doesn't talk about Dr. King. It also talks about Malcolm X. And the author is Dr. James Cone, one of my favorite theologians. He writes about he authored this book in 1991 called Martin and Malcolm: A Dream, Martin and Malcolm and America, A Dream or a Nightmare, by Dr. James Cone. And he talks about how both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, you know how they try to separate those two. And mind you, they didn't see eye to eye, in the beginning of their activism. But as say Malcolm X, because Malcolm X was first assassinated in 65, and then Martin Luther King in 68. Towards the end of Malcolm X's life, they started to realize that while they both had different methods of obtaining freedom for Black folks, they were actually on the same path. They actually both wanted the same thing as far as liberation of Black people in this country, and not just in this country, but in this world. So I want to read an excerpt from his book, Martin and Malcolm in America, where he talks about, and Dr. Cone also interacted with Dr. King as well. In his book, he writes, during the first 10 years of the civil rights movement, Martin King and others had assumed that the Blacks of the North would benefit indirectly but significantly from the victories gained in the South. The Watts riots and the dramatic rise in the popularity of the Black nationalist philosophy of Malcolm X showed that Martin overestimated the self-esteem that Northern Blacks would receive from the straightened up backs of their Southern brothers and sisters. While surveying the devastation of Watts, he was surprised that many Blacks there had never heard of him. When he gave a talk to a crowd of 300 Blacks at Westminster Community Center and counseled nonviolence, a man shouted, "Get out of here, Dr. King. We don't want you." Martin was particularly troubled when he heard a group of young Blacks boasting, "We won." "How can you say we won?" Martin retorted, "when 34 Negroes are dead, your community is destroyed, and whites are using the riots as an excuse for inaction." "We won because we made them pay attention to us," they shouted at him. When Martin reflected on that response and the hostile reactions to his message of nonviolence, he began to realize that the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Acts did not significantly reduce the problems of race and poverty, especially in the North. Watts wasn't suffering from segregation or the lack of civil rights, Paul Williams asserted. You didn't have two drinking fountains. When Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill in 1964, nobody even thought about it in Watts. It had nothing to do with us. Northern Blacks could already eat in white restaurants, could vote, and in theory, could attend integrated schools. But, as Malcolm pointed out, they had no money for a meal in the white man's restaurant, no representatives of their interest in government, and no control over the de facto segregated schools in their community. Trapped in the ghetto filth, victimized by poverty and police brutality, poor Blacks spent most of their time and energy trying to merely survive in a society which had totally neglected them. The Watts riots initiated a major turning point in Martin King's thinking about America. He began to see that there are literally two Americas, one beautiful, rich, and primarily white, and the other ugly, poor, and disproportionately Black. Martin's encounter with the other America, as he frequently referred to, helped him understand something of the world that created Malcolm X. Baynard Rustin, an advisor to King who met him in Watts, recalled the occasion. "I'll never forget the discussion we had with King that night. He was absolutely undone, and he looked at me and said, 'You know, Baynard, I worked to get these people the right to eat hamburgers. And now I've got something to do. I've got to help them get the money to buy them. End quote.
Wow. Okay, that really good.
So this is the Martin Luther King that we don't get on Martin Luther King birthday.
Hmm. And we only get that one part that I had a dream instead of like I've been researching the 1967 the revolutionary. I was listening to his speech and he was like look up the word black in the dictionary and you'll
Mm-hmm.
see it says evil and dark. And I said, wait, where did I hear that from? I said, what? I said, is this Martin Luther King saying this? Because I thought the only person that said that was not the only person, but Malcolm X. We from the autobiography of Malcolm X and the film, and that's what we heard it from. But I've never, in my 45 years of living, heard Martin Luther King say that, and it really opened my eyes. So I thank you for telling me about this different part of Martin Luther King Jr.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so we have to educate ourselves on his real work. And I often make comparisons and I'm not making, well, I wouldn't say I make comparisons, but I make parallels to what he has done and say and I'm a believer because I think about the work of Jesus Christ. Um a minister in first century Palestine who we kind of forget because as Christians we have this view of Jesus of being divine, fully divine, but he's also fully human. And this is something, and me and some of your listeners say know that I'm Catholic, and that's part of our Catholic catechism that we believe that Jesus is fully divine, but he is also fully human. When we think about Jesus's work, we think about his ministry. We forget about the human things that Jesus has done. Oh, let's just say we don't forget, but we don't pay attention to it. Because as we all know, Jesus was the one who sat with the sinners, sat with the tax collectors, talked to the prostitutes, healed sick people who most people during that society didn't want to, interact with, didn't want to touch. But Jesus, from my perspective, being a revolutionary in his own right, was the one that basically talked to these people on the margins. And I see Dr. King in that same light. Now, when we talk about Dr. King, because I think part of what this whole push of boxing Dr. King into this dreamer and making it that, the only thing he ever did in his life was make a speech in Washington, D.C. called I Have a Dream, it lends to the not just kind of minimizing, the rest of his work, but it also mythologizes him into something that he wasn't. And so we have to keep alive some of the work that is not talked about, some of the work that he actually has done. Because, and I'm afraid to say this, but if racism is still going on, hundreds of years from now, Dr. King's going to be white.
Oh,
Dr.
wow.
King is going to be white. And the story is going to be, well, Dr. King raised his hand and stopped the hoses. He told the dogs to stop attacking black folks. And he basically eliminated racism with the mighty swing of his hand. And we have to understand him from being mythology, mythology, these legends that keep coming up to certain people, basically devalues them. It really devalues them. So when I talk about King during these times, especially, when we celebrate his birthday, I hardly ever talk about the "I Have a Dream" speech because that was not the totality of his work. Dr. King has been an activist, 20 years, and we're not going to box him into one particular instance. We're not going to box him into, just this one thing that he's done. He's done a lot of things, and he's fought for a lot of causes that many people didn't want to be a part of. Like I was, just mentioning about the Vietnam War, and he speaks out against them. Many of his compatriots, including Baynard Rustin and Abernathy, suggested that he not speak against the war. But, Dr. King, even in the speech, had talked about it. He said that, he was going to lose a lot of friends. But he didn't care because his fight for justice wasn't about making friends. And sure enough, from my understanding, Time Magazine labeled him the most unpatriotic person in America.
Oh my gosh.
And people forget about that. People forget that Dr. King was very unpopular, during, especially during the end, towards the end of his life. I've had elders who have talked to me, who basically, and this is elders who have been in white spaces, who said when Dr. King got assassinated that some of them, and probably a lot of them who probably didn't express it, said that he kind of deserved what he got. But yet, a lot of white people celebrate his legacy. And these are some of the children of those people who probably said that he deserved what he deserved what he got. And so, Dr. King in his book, Where Do We Go From Here, talks about the white liberal. And I want to read an excerpt, if you don't mind.
Please.
I want to read an excerpt of his critique of white liberals and liberal racists. So he says, starting on page 93, he says, a leading voice in the course of social transition belongs to the white liberal. Whether he speaks through government, the church, the voluntary welfare agencies, or the civil rights movement. Over the last few years, many Negroes have felt that their most troublesome adversaries was not the obvious bigot of the Ku Klux Klan or the John Birch Society, but the white liberal who is more devout to order than to justice, who prefers tranquility to equality. In a sense, the white liberal has victimized some of the same ambiances that have been a constant part of our national heritage. Even in areas where liberals have great influence, labor unions, schools, churches, and politics, the situation of the Negro is not much better in areas where they are not dominant. This is why many liberals have fallen into the trap of seeing integration in merely aesthetic terms, where a token number of Negroes add color to a white-dominated power structure. They say, our union is integrated from top to bottom. We have one Negro on the executive board. Or, our neighborhood is making great progress in integrated houses. We have 2 Negro families. Or, our university has no problem with integration. We have 1 Negro family member and even 1 Negro chairman of our department. Often, white liberals are unaware of their latent prejudices. A while ago, I ran into a white woman who was anxious to discuss the race problem with me. She said, I'm very liberal. I have no prejudices against Negroes. I believe Negroes should have the right to vote, the right to a good job, the right to a decent home, and the right to have access to public accommodations. Of course, I must confess that I would not want my daughter to marry a Negro. This lady could not see that her failure to accept intermarriage negated her claim to general liberalism. She failed to see that implicit in her rejection was the feeling that her daughter had some pure, superior nature that would not be contaminated by the impure, inferior nature of the Negro. It is Teutonic origins theory warmed over. I have to look that up, see what that means. The question of intermarriage is never raised in a society cured of the disease of racism.
Mm-mm-mm.
So
We
yeah,
we never see this side at all.
mm-mm, nope.
Oh.
So he often warns us about, the white liberal, and and that's the whole thing about when people look at racism. You know, it's easy to identify the white people who calls other, who's comfortable with calling, black folks the N-word and such, and the Ku Klux Klan and Nazis and stuff like that. But what Dr. King also expresses is racism isn't just a feeling. Racism isn't just how you feel against, non-white people. That racism is actually a system. Racism is a social construct. While biologically it is not true, socially and politically it is enforced. Because when you look at the metrics of black folks in this country and around the world, um, we are technically at the bottom of economics, at education level, and just overall, society. When you're talking about the status of class, and there's only two conclusions you can come to on why this effect is happening. Like I said, black folks at the bottom of employment. Now we're at the top of unemployment. We're at the top of being incarcerated. That's also negative metrics. But there's only two conclusions that you can come to. Either black folks are inherently inferior and they just can't get a break in life, or there's a system of racism that keeps these figures in its place. So if you come to the conclusion that black folks are just inferior, then hey, you just buy into the system of what racists tell you, that black folks are technically inferior, even though historically um black societies back in the early times of human civilization have created civilizations. A lot of things that came out of Egypt and Nubia, mathematics that have come out that we use to today, have come out of Africa. A lot of spiritual philosophies like Christianity and Islam have come out of Africa. So if you want to ignore that history, hey, that's fine. But like I said, either you believe that there's a system of racism and you believe that black people are being held down to these low standards, or you believe that just black people are just inherently inferior. I unfortunately to some believe that it is more of the former than the latter, that there is a system of racism that keeps these statistics alive.
Okay. Um, Big Mike said, "Do you see any improvements from 1968 to today?"
I guess you have to define what improvements. Have we improved economically? I will probably say we might be worse economically when it comes to, say, the job market. Because when you think about, say, 68, there were a lot more factories, a lot more available manufacturing jobs. During that time, people can actually have a living wage without having to go to college. Because I've had several of my old uncles who didn't go to college, but they were able to make a living for themselves and actually get a pension or a wage because they worked in the steel mills. They worked in manufacturing jobs and they stayed there for like 20, 30 years. But you don't have that nowadays.
Very true.
Many of the manufacturing jobs are overseas now. So it was basically, I mean, right now it's imperative right now to get a bachelor's degree. And what's so interesting is, I got my bachelor's degree in the 90s, whereas even during that time, I mean, people had believed that, once I get my bachelor's degree, I can make, give me a job, make a lot of money. And while it was beneficial for me to graduate from college with a bachelor's degree, it wasn't like I was making a ton of money. I wasn't making this 6-figure job during that time. And mind you, let me tell you, I got my bachelor's degree in computer science. This is the 90s where technology sprung. And there were technology jobs abundant. Let me tell you something. I walked out of a job one week and got a job the next week. That's how confident I was getting a job during that time. But it wasn't like it was a whole bunch of money being, made. I just had enough to, get me a small apartment and a car and that's about it. But as manufacturing started to creep out of this country, you start to see the need for more people enrolling in college. But then the thing about it is that college doesn't really guarantee you a job.
Yeah.
So now universities are getting all of this money. People are going into, debt and default because they're taking out student loans, can't pay them back because, college is like, I mean, we're talking about going up to almost $200,000. And people are graduating with degrees that are not doctors or lawyers, which can actually pay them back. And we're not even going to talk about law school and medical school costs, because that costs 10 times more than a regular bachelor's degree. And so now we're in this quandary where we got a whole bunch of college educated people who ain't got no jobs. I mean, and then the labor unions who have transformed themselves, because labor unions back in the early 20th century were more geared towards working class people. But then at that point, they started to get in bed with the politicians. They started to get in bed with the corporate structures, and they have even taken on a capitalist mindset. Whereas labor unions now are started being more restrictive, because when Booker T. Washington started talking about, he wasn't completely wrong, where he wanted more black people to focus on manual labor and not focus too much on politics. Yes, that is true, because with electricians, electricians make like at the minimum $50 an hour. That's some good money, for an electrician. However, the problem is that getting into those electrical unions, especially when they don't have a lot of black people in there. So how do we get into those particular sectors and jobs? Because now those jobs have been closed off to us. And now we're faced with economic deprivation, where you enter the from the from the late 60s to all the way up to the 90s, you have the drug market. You have drugs flooded into most black and brown communities, mostly black communities in that matter. And the only way black folks can make a living is through the underground economy of drugs, which unfortunately ruined families, which unfortunately killed a lot of young people, a lot of young innocent people at that. So has there been improvement since 68? Depends on how you look at it, but I say we probably have gone backwards since 68.
Wow. Harley's mom said, in your opinion, what is the best way a white person can make a difference today?
Hmm. I don't want to give the response
Yeah.
that Malcolm X said.
Yeah. That made me think of Malcolm X immediately.
You know what? I will say this because I think I've had that question asked before, but you know, white people could just tell other white people, because I'll say this, there are some white people who are genuine in the struggle, who generally want to uh uh be anti-racist and work against the system of racism. And I think the first steps is to tell some of your friend and family members who believe in the inferiority of black people to, hey, you know what? To educate them, like, no, black people aren't like that. And I think it's I think it's probably their duty to just educate, the enlightened white folks to kind of like tell their own people to stop being racist. I mean, that's the best thing that I can say, for them, uh, is to, you know, give it to their own people, because um, I think if you perpetuate, if you help stop the perpetuation of racism from the people who it benefits from, because I always say this, the only the only people that benefits from racism is white people. And I think if they understand not to receive those benefits from racism, because I mean, obviously there are very conscious racist people that are intentional about racism, people who are comfortable of using very derogatory terms towards black people. But then there are the ones, like Dr. King says, the white liberals who kind of says that they're not racist, but they don't know that they benefit from the system of racism. And then they say things like the conversation Dr. King had with the white woman, saying that she would never let her daughter marry a Negro man. Those are the kind of like more of the unconscious type of racists. But I think, like I said, the intentionality has to be there to fight racism amongst white people, because of the fact that when they uncover the way that they live, they'll find out that a lot of things that they benefit from is from racism. And so they have to kind of dissect that themselves, because we as black people, we suffer from it. We suffer from it. So I think it's to their best ability to kind of like dissect it and see where they benefit from, and try to work from there.
That's a great answer. Thank you, Harley. Thank you, Gardis. Scott, I know you have a meeting soon, but a couple of more questions if you got a couple of more minutes.
Hmm.
Scott Johnson said, I've read that the system for college tuition was put into place primarily as a means to keep blacks from becoming educated.
I mean, I could see that, because a lot of radicalism starts at the college universities. When we think about some of the more prominent figures in our history, especially, especially like people that we read about, like Dr. King and the Black Panthers and most of the Black Panthers. These people were college educated. Angela Davis was a college professor. So most of it basically starts at the college universities. Now, mind you, like I said, college necessarily isn't there to kind of like help you get a job. I mean, it could prepare you for it. I mean, obviously they do have job placement programs at some colleges, and there's some, um there's some academic disciplines that, you have to get a college education. Like, being a doctor, being a lawyer, those require college education. But like for instance, with me, I work in technology. You don't have to get a college degree to work in IT. I've ran into worked with several people who didn't get their bachelor's or master's degree, and they're doing the same job I'm doing. So it's one of those fields where, you really don't have to get an education. However, what they started seeing, like I said, and I would probably say, like, take for instance the Black Panther Party. Bobby Seals and UMP Newton were law students at I think it was it Fresno University or something like that. And this is where a lot of radicalization happens in these universities, because when we're talking about reading, because universities have several hidden things in it where it can open up the eyes of people, and especially when you start reading. I always say this: it's kind of hard to control a person who likes to read a lot and read a lot of different things. But also too, especially if you're a critical reader, not reading everything that you believe, but actually looking at it, dissecting it, and studying it. Because there's a difference between reading a book and studying a book. Studying a book basically goes beyond just, reading everything it says. So, like, for instance, Where Do We Go From Here? The book that I was referencing, Dr. King. I've actually read this several times. I've studied it. And not everything I agree with Dr. King is written in this book. But I mean, it doesn't throw away what he has done, or even some of the critiques that he has, with everyday life, in this country, politically or economically. So there might be some things that I might disagree with him on, but overall, he has some of the same thoughts that I have in regards to this, and I've taken some of the thoughts that he's had in society, and I've kind of like refined it a little bit more. So he's given me a baseline to kind of think of more contemporary politics, because, Where Do We Go From Here? He wrote that in 1967, and life in 1967 was much different than life it is now. But I can take those values and philosophies and kind of like shape it to what we're doing today. So no, I mean, yeah, I just think that there is a movement to keep Black folks out of college, and this has been happening for a long time. I think when during the late 80s, early 90s, when HBCU shirts became popular, because we started seeing on the Cosby Show, and enrollment in Black universities started going up. Yeah, there was a concern about, more Black people going to college than not. And yeah, I think the cost of tuition started to rise, and it kind of like kept a lot of Black folks out. But now what they do is they make it accessible to get student loans, and now they trap a lot of black people in debt because of it.
Yeah. Big Mike said in the 1960s, the student loan program made sense today. It's out of control. The cost of college has risen over 3 times the rate of inflation, and that's due to the student loan program. Yeah.
Yeah, and the student loan program has uh has caused a lot of people to default on their loans, which causes them to, have a low credit score, which means you can't get a house. You could probably not buy a car. And it's a mark. It's like a red mark on your, economically to you.
So, Gardis, why should people look at Dr. King more as a revolutionary than a dreamer, in your opinion?
Because it's the part of Dr. King that the establishment doesn't want you to see. Because they want you to see Dr. King as this docile um, man who just says he dreams about a perfect world. And they use that image of him as a weapon against those who are coming up, those who are, trying to learn about, Black history, because, obviously there's a movement out here to ban Black history. They call it CRT, critical race theory, which is insane, because critical race theory, a couple of years ago, many of the Trump Republicans had accused certain schools of teaching CRT, or critical race theory. And that's almost impossible, because critical race theory is actually a real academic discipline that is only taught in high-level graduate courses and law school. They don't teach critical race theory in public school, like in elementary or high schools, or even in undergrad college level courses. Critical race theory is a high-level graduate course or a law course. And the thing about critical race theory, it talks about the racist origins of certain laws that are around in the United States, like redlining. So those are the topics that critical, and even though some Black history courses would touch on that, it was not teaching critical race theory, which is something totally different. So Dr. King's legacy needs to be taught. The Revolutionary King needs to be taught, because it's actually what he really fought for one, because it's the truth. But also, too, we have to inspire to be more resistant towards the system. Because the goal of the system is to unfortunately, the goal of the system is to kill us and to benefit off of our deaths. And I think if we look at it from a higher perspective, because this is what Dr. King was trying to teach us, and he was trying to draw out for us, that there is a higher fight in this whole movement of not just civil rights, but human rights. That there's a spiritual fight, that the important part of what he said, the revolution of values, we have to as individuals, as a collective, reevaluate what we really value. Most of the time we get our values from TV, from radio. Nowadays it's social media. We get told what we should value. And most of the time our values are based in materialistic, monetary, money, or, whatever type of gain we can get from monetary or money, like cars, houses, whatever. And we kind of see this as, quote unquote revolutionary, because one of the things that we have to understand is, so there's this thing called uh, black buying power that has been going around our community for a long time. And there are many people, many economists, especially black economists, who feel like, if we can get our own businesses and get, and employ a lot of black folks, that we can liberate ourselves. And many people are talking about liberating ourselves through economics. I have nothing against that. I do feel like, yeah, we do need more businesses, but that is not the single road to liberation, because black people face so many problems outside of economics that economics is not the end all be all to our solutions. Understand, we still have a social issue. We still have an issue of education. We still have issues of various things, which economics can help, but it's not the end all be all. So I want to read one more thing about black buying power that Dr. King talks about in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? It starts on page 51. It says, however much we pool our resources and quote unquote buy black, this cannot create the multiplicity of new jobs and provide the number of low-cost houses that will lift the Negro out of the economic depression caused by centuries of deprivation. Neither can our resources supply quality integrated education. All of this requires billions of dollars, which only in an alliance of liberal labor civil rights forces can stimulate. In short, the Negro's problem cannot be solved unless the whole American society takes a new turn towards a greater economic justice. So what Dr. King is saying is that black buying power is not going to liberate us.
Mm.
Now, he doesn't speak against it. He encourages it. And I encourage it too. I mean, listen, look, if there was a choice for me to buy some item between a black business and Walmart, I would supply the black business my money, even if it costs more. But that's not going to just liberate us. And there's been this movement of people who are encouraging folks to quit good paying jobs to start their own business because they want economic liberation. And don't get me wrong, there's just certain people who don't want to work for folks. And I get that. But then for me, who I'm a worker, because I just never had the motivation to start my own business, because I don't know what I want to start my business on. So I just work. And actually, from most people's perspective, I get a good paying job. So why would I quit my job to find quote unquote economic liberation because I make my own money if I'm on, if I'm making like 50% less than what I was making at the job? So economic liberation is not the end all be all, because if we see in history, there were economic towns that were established in the early 20th century. When you're talking about Tulsa, Oklahoma, Black Wall Street, you're talking about Rosewood, Florida, Wilmington, Delaware. These were places where black businesses thrived. But yet what happened to them? Mobs of white people came and tore it down. The first instance of a major American city being bombed from the air was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Black Wall Street.
Yeah.
So the thing is that, yeah, let's say we do rebuild Black Wall Street. What mechanisms we're going to put in place to protect it? So I think it's important to understand what Dr. King was telling us, because liberation is not it's not an easy road. And I think we have these one button solutions that people are trying to give us to say, hey, all we got to do is just, fix the economics and we'll be fine. No, that's only part of it.
Mm, very true. Um, Scott said the system is designed to kill in multiple ways. How they market unhealthy foods to black communities, the cost of health care, lack of access to dialysis, the profits from type 2 diabetes meds. Yeah.
Yeah, and they find more ways to do this. And this is why environmental justice is starting to come into play, because now we're seeing areas, areas predominated by black residents where water is being contaminated or actually taken away.
Mm-hmm.
We're actually seeing instances of that here in the Southland. Water main breaks happening in Markham. Now all of a sudden people don't have water anymore. Like, that can happen anytime to any group of people.
Yeah.
University Park a couple of years ago, it was giving out. I remember contributing two cases of water down there because they ain't had no water.
Yeah, I remember.
So yeah, I mean, I call it economic. I mean, not economic, but environmental terrorism, if you ask me.
Mm. Delta said without the ability to defend themselves, they were just rich targets. Speaking of Tulsa as well, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, it goes beyond just economic power and even political power, because we have to have a way to defend our resources.
Mm. I want to read this, but I want to look that up, Big Mike. That is awesome. I didn't know that the state of Missouri used to pay for the college education for blacks to go to any school outside of Missouri. Even if that student got into Harvard, Missouri would pay for it. That's awesome.
No,
Mm.
that's actually interesting.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thanks for
I,
sharing
I
that.
I would, yeah, I want to know what was the purpose behind that. Like, because I mean, there's several universities in Missouri, but I'm pretty sure Harvard costs much more than going to either Kansas, University of Kansas, or Mizzou. So what would be the purpose behind that? But I mean, yeah, I don't know. That's a good, that's something to look into.
I agree. That's I love to hear that. Well, Gardis, I appreciate you. This is interesting. Now, um, before any final thoughts, or you would like to share with us?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, for those who like to research Dr. King, I would suggest, um, like I said, going beyond the boundaries of what you've been taught in school.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Reading, actually, like I said, reading his works, because he actually, I think, but Dr. King published 3 books, 3 or 4 books. But I always reference, like I said, the first book you need to read of his is Where Do We Go From Here? I think he wrote another book, is like Why We Can't Wait. I would also suggest um, reading or even watching some of his speeches outside of I Have a Dream, or some of the speeches after 1965. Like I said, one of his most important speeches to me is the Vietnam speech. I highly suggest people to read or listen to that, because I think that is the Dr. King that made him unpopular and also a target for assassination. So
Wow.
I would suggest you study him, and also look at works that deal with Dr. King, that looks at it from another perspective. Like I was referencing the James Cone book, Chaos or Community. Where do we go from? I mean, not Chaos or Community, but the Martin and Malcolm in America, A Dream or a Nightmare by
Yes.
James Cone.
Yes.
I would suggest, people read that perspective because of the fact that, you know, he gives an interesting perspective of not choosing between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, but understanding that they were basically fighting for the same goal. Even though they they weren't on the same page when they first started, but Malcolm had discovered that Dr. King, was really fighting for black people. And when Martin Luther King, when Malcolm X was assassinated in 65, Martin Luther King had realized that Malcolm X was right about a lot of things.
Mm.
And that maybe, and a lot of people feel like this is probably what made Dr. King more into a revolutionary type of figure, because Dr. King on record has said a lot of things that Malcolm X was right about,
Yes.
that he disagreed with, but he said Malcolm was right on a lot of this stuff. And then one last book that I wanted to suggest is, there's a book that was written recently called Prophet of Discontent, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Critique of Racial Capitalism. It's by Andrew Douglas and Jared Loggins, and basically kind of talks about Dr. King's critique of capitalism, racial capitalism at that, because they feel like racism and capitalism are closely connected to each other, and that capitalist societies basically enable racism and racial inequality. And so they don't go as far, like I said, just they don't go as far as labeling him a Marxist or anything like that, or communist, because people often tend to, and this, Berg, if you're not on one side, then you must be on the other. And nobody wants, like the most unpopular side is the middle.
Yeah.
and that's what Dr. King was. He was the guy that was in the middle, trying to sort all of this out. So the book actually talks about his critique of capitalism, and also too, Dr. King, while he critiqued Karl Marx and his, and his theory of communism, he also studied the Karl Marx. It wasn't like he got secondhand information about. He actually read Karl Marx's book, and you can appreciate somebody who critiques somebody who actually read his work. You're not going to sit here and tell me that a Stephen King book was bad, but then you never read it.
Right.
So yeah. So while he does critique Karl Marx, he actually did read his book. So Dr. King was a very complex and dynamic man, but very important to our struggle in Black liberation. So my suggestion, like I said, go beyond the boundaries of what you know to really understand who the man really was.
Yeah. And thank you for that, because we're only taught that one. I see a lot of people, we immediately go to my friend Martin and I have the dream speech. I have a dream speech, but we don't go beyond that at all. So thank you so much. And I linked the books. I'm going to put those in the description box for those that want to check it out. And also, I put a coupon at the top for you guys to get free 30 days on Audible. I hope I'm saying it right. So that you guys can listen to it for free. Listen to a couple of the books that Gardis mentioned for free.
Yep.
That's it's the celebration. Have you ever been to the Martin Luther King breakfast in Chicago?
Which one is that?
They usually have one in Hyde Park. I just thought maybe you went to that one a couple of times, but um, just wondering if you have been there and if they kind of softball Martin Luther King there or not when they speak on him. Just wondering. Just was wondering.
Oh, I don't know. I don't think I've been there, but
Oh, okay.
yeah. But
Yeah.
I would suggest also to I believe Stanford University has access to the King papers. So
Oh.
these are basically articles, essays that King wrote while he was a seminary student.
Mhm.
But also too, they might have some speeches that he's, and I believe some of it is free. Like you don't have to have a login or something like that. But
Yeah, I'm looking for him now. The Stanford. Um, thank you.
the King, yeah, the King papers. So yeah, people could look at that and see. Like
It's,
you should have access to some of it, but I'm not sure if you have access to all of it.
I am putting it in the chat.
Okay, all right.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. We got a lot of research to do, you guys.
Mm-hmm.
This
Yep.
is really interesting. So technically, um, the way the way they tell it's not. I have a question before you go. Did he when he in 1967 like the theology part of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Did that go to the wayside a little bit more that he became more revolutionary, or did he merge the church and all of that in one? Do you think?
Well, no, because the thing about King was because of the fact that he lived like he lived and preached a nonviolent life.
Hmm.
He basically was mirroring. He basically was mirroring the work of Jesus Christ,
Yeah. Okay.
and
You were
so
speaking on that. Hmm.
yeah, and he was, and it was not, his theology never went by the wayside. Matter of fact, if you read, and this was actually before the last 3 years when his letter in a Birmingham jail,
Hmm.
he critiques the church because he felt like the church didn't do anything to fight for the rights of of not just black folks but the poor and oppressed, which
Yeah.
is which is the main center of the gospel message that Jesus was preaching. Jesus, like I said, what did Jesus say? Jesus said he was there to give poor people good news. I believe it was Luke 4. He proclaimed good news to the poor, give sight to the blind, and free all prisoners and slaves. And so that was Jesus's message. And Dr. King was kind of like in the same mold. So no, I don't think he dropped the theology. Matter of fact, he redefined it to make it more palatable for us to understand, because theology is not just reading the Bible. Theology is actually doing the work. Being a Christian is not just believing, quote unquote, believing in, Jesus and God, but being a Christian is actually doing the work of Jesus. So no, I think his theology was more of a theology, on Hans theology.
Thank you. And Scott says the clergy will almost always align themselves with politicians versus serving the interests of people, primarily because of the power, influence, and riches. It sort of is. Sometimes it feels like church is politics too, as well.
And Dr. King, like I said, was facing that back in the 60s. The letter in the Birmingham jail talks about that. So yeah, it's been happening for a long time, but and unfortunately, we as the church growing people refuse to stop it for some reason or another. But you know, that's another story.
Gardis, I thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion. I always appreciate your input. You always teach us something new. I thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for giving me the platform to discuss this.
Of course. Thank you so much.
All righty.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, that's Mr. Gardis Watts Jr. He always just opens my eyes to something different. Let me tell you, my library is expanding now. sometimes I only saw things one way, and it was how things were taught, were coming up. I have a dream, that's it. Stevie Wonder sang happy birthday, that's it. That's as far as I was going with Martin Luther King Jr. And I really appreciate you guys really chiming in for this conversation where we forget about all those people. Remember, I was saying respect the sacrifice. We have to respect the sacrifice that so many people gave for us to be here today. And one thing Gardis said that stuck out was if we keep if it keep going, like they'll just change. Martin Luther King may turn into a white person in 100 years from now. That's if we do not keep teaching the history, keep saying the names of the people that sacrificed for us. He mentioned so many other people today that I definitely want to go over. I think it was was it Medgar Evers as well, and some people that were not a fan of Martin Luther King Jr., but they didn't stand in his way. Also, the riots. You guys, we got notes. We probably have to do a part two to this. Um, because it's so much more that so many more people that were a part of the civil rights movement that do not get their flowers. And Martin Luther King, he's like in the forefront. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you for being here, Scott, Delta. I put the link in here. Big Mike, everybody, thank you for being here. Everyone that joined us. Brandon, I'm missing some people. I can't see, but you are right here. I appreciate you so, so much. Harley's mom, everyone. Um, I want to just end this with, we can't play the whole speech because of copyright, but I wanted to make sure that you guys had at least the last 7 minutes. And this is MLK, the Other America. I think this was at Stanford University. Correct me if I'm wrong. Um, and I'll put the link here for you guys. So if you want to watch it, this is his speech. Let's celebrate and give thanks to his works. I'm missing out. Hold on. All right, let's go ahead and play this. And thanks for joining me, you guys. Thanks for rocking with the content when we talk history and different subject matters. I know you might have been introduced to me from one subject matter or another, but I appreciate you giving the other content a chance. And thank you again to Gardis Watts for bringing this educational and this different perspective of Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.
Let me say another thing that's more in the realm of the spirit, I guess. That is, if we are to go on in the days ahead and make true brotherhood a reality, it is necessary for us to realize more than ever before that the destinies of the Negro and the white man are tied together. Now, there's still a lot of people who don't realize this. The races still don't realize this. But it is a fact now that Negroes and whites are tied together. And we need each other. The Negro needs the white man to save him from his fear. The white man needs the Negro to save him from his guilt. We are tied together in so many ways: our language, our music, our cultural patterns, our material prosperity, and even our food are an amalgam of black and white. And so there can be no separate black path to power and fulfillment that does not intersect white roots. There can be no separate white path to power and fulfillment short of social disaster. It does not recognize the need of sharing that power with black aspirations for freedom and justice. We must come to see now that integration is not merely a romantic or aesthetic something where you merely add color to a still predominantly white power structure. Integration must be seen also on political terms where there is shared power, and where black men and white men share power together to build a new and a great nation. In a real sense, we're all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. John Donne placed it years ago in graphic terms: no man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. And he goes on toward the end to say, any man's death diminishes me because I'm involved in mankind. Therefore never sin to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. And so we all in the same situation. The salvation of the Negro will mean the salvation of the white man, and the destruction, the life, and of the ongoing progress of the Negro will be the destruction of the ongoing progress of the nation. Now let me say finally that we have difficult days ahead, but I haven't despaired. Somehow I maintain hope in spite of hope, and I've talked about the difficulties and how hard the problems will be as we tackle them. But I want to close by saying this afternoon that I still have faith in the future, and I still believe that these problems can be solved. And so I will not join anyone who will say that we still can't develop a coalition of conscience. I realize and understand the discontent and the agony and the disappointment and even the bitterness of those who feel that whites in America cannot be trusted. And I would be the first to say that there are all too many who are still guided by the racist ethos. But I am still convinced that there are still many white persons of goodwill, and I'm happy to say that I see them every day in the student generation, who cherish democratic principles and justice above principle, and who will stick with the cause of justice and the cause of civil rights and the cause of peace throughout the days ahead. And so I refuse to despair. I think we're going to achieve our freedom, because however much America strays away from the ideals of justice, the goal of America is freedom. Abused and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up in the destiny of America. Before the Pilgrim Fathers landed at Plymouth, we were here. Before Jefferson etched across the pages of history the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence, we were here. Before the beautiful words of the Star-Spangled Banner were written, we were here. And for more than 2 centuries, our forebears labored here without wages. They made cotton king. They built the homes of their masters in the midst of the most humiliating and oppressive conditions. And yet out of a bottomless vitality, they continued to grow and develop. And I say that if the inexpressible cruelties of slavery couldn't stop us, the opposition that we now face, including the so-called white backlash, will surely fail. We're going to win our freedom, because both the sacred head of our nation and the eternal will of the Almighty God are embodied in our echoing demands. And so I can still sing, we shall overcome. We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. We shall overcome because Carlyle is right. No lie can live forever. We shall overcome because William Cullen Bryant is right. Truth crushed earth will rise again. We shall overcome because James Russell Lowell is right. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future. With faith, we will be able to hew out of the mounting of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to speed up the day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and live together as brothers and sisters all over this great nation. That will be a great day. That will be a great tomorrow. In the word, sure to speak symbolically, that will be the day when the morning stars will sing together and the sons of God will shout for joy. Thank you.
Commentary, blue, commentary, burgundy, commentary, commentary, blue,
and help welcome
commentary,
our honored, distinguished guest, the Reverend Dr.